great to see you all here. Saw some of you yesterday. So yeah, we ran yesterday the second annual Sentiment Analysis Symposium. It's a really focused conference and it had a great turnout. We filled the room, including the area back there. We were really happy to, cool. We were really happy to have Lexalytics as a platinum level sponsor of that conference, and Jeff participated in the Visionaries panel that we had there. And it was great to have Jeff on that panel because Lexalytics has been in the sentiment analysis business as a focused company for longer than any other company focusing on the sentiment analysis area. So sentiment analysis is really gaining loads of attention for all kinds of applications for social media, online media, monitoring, analysis, extracting information from all of those sources, but also for more traditional enterprise information sources that could include and do include everything from routine enterprise communications with customers within the enterprise to enterprise feedback, that is a fancier term for surveys that was coined by one of the vendors. Often vendors will coin their own terms to refer to a particular market area in order to corner that area. So first off, two things. I'm not Seth Redmore. Several people have approached me about conference-related stuff because my name is Seth. Yesterday we actually had 3 Seths in attendance, and fortunately and unfortunately a fourth one dropped out. The third was Seth Early, who is sort of the guru of taxonomies. Runs a company called Early and Associates, and the one who dropped out unfortunately was Amit Seth. Well, that's a last name there, who is with Nielsen. So in any case, maybe we should do what my high school son does, which is his friends call him Grimes, but I don't know about that. Maybe Seth G or something. So Seth Redmore says that, we should, if you're going to tweet this, use the Twitter hashtag LUG11. So I'm going to do some tweeting, although not while I'm standing right here. Yeah, I will. I thought about just making up a hashtag, but so I'm glad you all did that. So I was given the brief of giving a briefing, an analyst briefing. If you don't know who I am, nowadays I give people my, turn it on. Nowadays I give people my Twitter ID because that sort of serves as a gateway to other information about me. Once you get to the Twitter ID, you can follow a link, usually if the person has put something in his or her Twitter profile to get other information about people. So I try to use Twitter a lot. What I do personally, if you don't know me, is I work in 3 areas. Or in 3 ways. I work as a consultant for end-user organizations, and then also for technology providers, and then sometimes for organizations that are halfway between those, namely organizations that are looking to license technology that they can then build into their own products and services. So examples of those include a Canadian company called DNA13 that was looking very closely at Lexalytics a couple of years ago, and they actually hired me to recommend companies in addition to other than Lexalytics that they should look at because they felt they needed to get a broader view of the market. And I went ahead and did that. I won't tell you what the companies I recommended they look at were, but in any case, they did go ahead and choose Lexalytics, so I guess I didn't do a very good job or something. Then I also do a lot of writing. I have for a number of years. Right now, most of my stuff comes out in InformationWeek, which is an information technology industry publication. And then the third thing I do is work as an industry analyst, sort of a de facto accidental analyst, I like to call it. So I've never worked for a Gartner or Forrester type of company, but I do similar types of work in terms of studying the market, the technology providers, the demand that develops in the market, and I'll incorporate some of the work that I've done as an analyst into my presentation that I'll give you this morning. So my presentation is titled, this is a title that Seth Redmore suggested with a minor modification that I made myself, My title is Converging Silos of Text Analysis. I like that he suggested the word analysis rather than analytics, although I don't know whether that was intentional on his part, because in a way analysis is somehow broader and more general than the idea of analytics, and it's maybe less off-putting. Also, people tend to associate analytics in the kind of the broader world with web analytics, which is often actually very shallow counting type of technology, rather than something more sophisticated and deeper, the kind of sophisticated and deeper that you need to get into if you are working with human language. I added the parentheses there, text analysis, because part of the key point that I really want to bring across is that you're going to get much greater insights, you're going to get much greater business benefit if you do bridge text analysis and text analytics into every other form of enterprise analysis that you're doing. Just to give you a quick example, so I referred to the use of text analytics for sentiment analysis for enterprise feedback, namely surveys. Well, surveys traditionally, of course, have included questions with numerical responses, Likert scales, rate something on a scale of 1 to 5. Well, you're going to get greater analytical lift is the term if you marry together information from transactional records, information from those 1 to 5 ratings on a survey, with the qualitatively sourced information that you can access with text analytics. So let's start off for real with a quotation here. This is kind of high tone, isn't it? The Word created the world and came before the world. It lit up like a light in the darkness. Carl Gustav Jung. Well, that's the point here, is that we communicate in words, whether it's spoken words or written words or whatever, and you all can understand what I'm saying, presumably, but if I were giving this presentation in Brazil or something like that, a large proportion of the audience wouldn't understand. So really, understanding words is central. This quotation actually harkens back to other materials. I don't know if it resonates with you in any particular way, but really it has biblical origins in two senses. It talks about it lit up like a light in the darkness. This resonates with, and it actually draws from the first books of the Bible, where you don't have to believe or anything to understand that of course the Bible creates has had a great influence on the development of Western culture and the way we all think. God created light and separated the light from the darkness and so on. So this is resonating back to that, as well as to the opening phrases from the Gospels from John that talks about the Word. In the beginning there was the Word, and the Word became flesh, and so on. So there is a lot of depth in words, and we need to understand that depth. So words have a number of forms that, well, when you give presentations, when you try to accomplish anything that really has any value, you have to do a bit of reductionism. You have to make things simpler and so on. So I'll do a little bit of reduction here. We have spoken and heard words. Those are not necessarily the same things. You don't have the same background I do, and I'm talking to people who are very similar to me in a lot of ways. You don't necessarily hear what I have to say. We have written words, and then words as they are read. Again, the same kind of problem, that I might wish to be communicating something, but you may be understanding something different from what I'm communicating. And then, of course, cultural standards, political standards, societal standards, and mores and ways of understanding really evolve. So I think of the recent controversy with Huckleberry Finn, Mark Twain's book, which very liberally uses a word that is not used very commonly anymore by anyone who's polite. And there was a case of a school district, I guess it was, that was trying to sanitize Huckleberry Finn by substituting the word slave in for this other word, which I won't even use. That changes meaning and so on. So my point here is that words, communications have a lot of cultural context to them that changes over time, that changes depending on where and to whom you're talking. And that's very relevant actually to all of us, because the kind of things, the way people communicate in an online forum and by email for that matter, or in face-to-face conversations can be very different from how they communicate in other contexts. When you know people, when you're directly addressing people, you're going to perhaps speak differently, speak or write differently from how you speak or write when you're posting perhaps anonymously online. We have text that is unstructured and structured. People love to throw in this unstructured term when talking about text and also about other forms of communication that would include, in particular, images and audio and visual. I haven't included a picture here that I often use of the Brooklyn Bridge, and my argument there is that there's no more structured object in the world, in the physical world, than a bridge. You can describe, you can map out the equations that describe the cables that support a suspension bridge and so on, but that photograph itself is just a set of binary bits in a computer file. So we see the structure there, even if to a computer it's just a file of bits. So the structure is there in language. The structure is there in the form of word morphology, how we form words, how we string together words to form phrases and sentences, commonly known as syntax. At a more macro or higher level, how we string together sentences in order to create an argument, a narrative, if you want, how we have a conversation. So words have structure in a lot of forms. So what we really want to do is use computer programs to discover that structure so that we can stick stuff in a database and we can run all of this through data analysis programs and automate what you and I are doing right now, communicating. I have a quotation here that I really like that actually dates back a couple of decades from expert systems pioneer Edward Feigenbaum. Reading from text in general is a hard problem because it involves all of common sense knowledge. Well, this harkens back to my last slide with a quotation from Jung, where I said that the quotation was pulling from biblical sources and so on. You might not have known that. People from other cultures might not have known that, and it still makes sense to you. But once again, if you do have this common sense knowledge, this cultural background, then you're going to understand things in a different way from how other people will understand them. So we're here to talk about text analytics, sentiment analysis in particular. I'm not going to give you a discourse on text analytics because presumably you know this stuff already, but what I want to do is kind of frame the rest of my talk and frame it by just creating some outlines for the whole subject that we're going to cover. So I'm making a set of assertions here that text analytics encompasses technologies that do, well, I have 5 bullet points, and again, I'm kind of reducing and simplifying, but in order to make things understandable. By the way, if people want copies of my slides, I'll be happy to give them to you later. I don't know whether I'll post these online or not. So text analytics, 5 technologies. Find and collect source materials of interest. Yeah, true. Yeah, okay. Yeah, I don't know how you're going to be posting the talks online later. Yeah. Okay. In any case, I would be happy to give people the slides. You can't do any kind of analysis unless you have something to analyze. And of course, it's a huge world out there, especially with the explosion in information that's online and social forums, not only online in the sense of on the web, but also, of course, information that people send to one another via text messaging. For that matter, if you really want to expand things, there are voice messages and recorded telephone calls or even unrecorded ones. And I'll say a bit later more about this, but of course we want to react to information as it is produced, perhaps in a lot of cases. We're entering a mentality where, because storage is increasingly cheap and the compute power is increasingly powerful and cheap, we're entering an era where we'll have the mentality of not throwing anything away, trying to retain every single bit of information, maybe with the idea of extracting business value from it later, even if not right now. But in any case, the first thing we have to do before we analyze information is we have to gather it, gather material that's going to be relevant to what we want to do. We gather information and then we categorize and classify. I use those 2 words, which are often used synonymously or interchangeably. I use them differently. To me, categorize means create the categories, and classify means take a given bit of information and put it into one of the categories that you created. So categorization process can be, I would call it top-down. You can perhaps have a business analyst who says, these are the categories that make sense in our business domain based on my 20 years of experience in the domain. So these are the ones that we're going to use. You can have a categorization that is bottom-up via some form of data mining or text data mining technology, where you set some software loose on the information sources and it discovers the categories that are prevalent in the source information. However you want to do it, there's categorization, then there's the idea of whatever categories you have, sticking new pieces of information in the bins that you've created. To me, this is a form of predictive analytics, which is a real hot topic in a number of business domains. We want to extract the information content. The information content is going to be, I think we all realize now, dependent on the context in which something is expressed. If I say something in one context, it's going to be different from another context. If I say something to someone in a heated argument and I use some profanity or threaten the person or something, that's perhaps not going to be, that's going to have one weight, versus if I post it online in the context of equivalent profanity about the service that I received at some restaurant and how the waiter was rude to me and so on. That's a kind of awkward example, but I think you understand that information content extraction is dependent on context. It's also dependent on the business job that you have at hand. If you are reading a review that's posted to TripAdvisor, take example of the Bellagio, because I know that Lexalytics and the TripAdvisor people like that. If you're reading that as someone who's potentially going to stay at that property, you're going to be reading it very differently from someone who works for that property and is looking for problems that should be reacted to and resolved. So the information content is important and depends on the business use and the context in which it's expressed. Text analytics needs to generate insights and predictive models. It's one thing to extract a bunch of facts like that I personally stayed at the Bellagio in January and had certain reactions to it. Well, that's great, but what did all the rest of the people who stayed there and stayed at competing properties in Las Vegas have to say about their own experience? How are we doing relative to the others? So the process of generating insights and perhaps doing some prediction is separate from the information extraction process. We need to interpret and respond to queries. For instance, you might create some kind of knowledge base and set aside that information for later, and without prejudging what people are going to do with the information, you need to then be able to query that knowledge base later in order to respond to whatever business challenges are at hand at that particular moment. We don't have to automate this text analytics, or I'll call it a text analysis process. We don't have to automate it. That's clear. Why? How is it clear? I mean, you understand me now. I'm speaking in spoken text. Humans communicate this way. You don't have to automate it, but we're automating it all the same. And why is that? I claim automation is not necessary, but it is sufficient. Automation is sufficient in the case of IBM Watson to beat a couple of the all-time champions at Jeopardy. Automation enabled IBM to do this by harvesting a whole huge variety of information sources, extracting information, the information extraction I talked to a moment ago, into a structured database, handling queries in an ad hoc manner. So Watson had to interpret the questions that were, Watson isn't really a question answering system, it's an answer questioning system, because Jeopardy works backwards. You're given answers and you're expected to come up with questions. Well, of course, that's just a little bit of, that's just a conceit. But anyway, so Watson had to interpret the queries, the questions that were thrown at it, in a particular context. That context for Watson is Jeopardy in this instance. Jeopardy, the answers were already categorized. Now, there's loads of puns and jokes in the way that Jeopardy categories are constructed, but Watson had some clues there. So it had to do that step that I referred to a moment ago on the last slide of handling queries or questions or whatever. And it had to present the results, do some analysis. That's happening here, where Watson comes up with a number of candidate responses by pulling information that comes from a variety of sources and weighing those those possible responses to find out which is the one that's most probable, and then buzzing in if it found that it probably, to a fair degree of certainty, had the response to a given Jeopardy question. So there's analysis going on there. Watson wasn't perfect, missed a few questions. My interpretation is that Watson actually beat Ken Jennings not because it knew more, but because it was much faster on the buzzer than Jennings could ever possibly be. In any case, automation wasn't necessary to play Jeopardy. We got two humans up there, one of them who could have won if he could have buzzed in faster than Watson, but it was sufficient to beat the two humans. One further key point to draw from Watson is that it was fast on the buzzer. It could do something that a human couldn't do. It could analyze a huge amount of information, come to a decision much quicker than even champion humans could. So that's the real power of automation here, doing things very quickly, very broadly, and producing results that answer a business challenge. In this case, the business challenge is a game, but Watson is moving on to other areas, for instance, in healthcare, medical diagnoses, and so on. And you'll see this stuff surface, as I'll discuss later, in other business domains. Well, so if a machine can beat human champions at a game like Jeopardy, or 12 years ago, other IBM technology beat the chess champion Garry Kasparov, are we at the end of history, as a historian and societal political critic Francis Fukuyama said a number of years ago in a famous essay? The end of history, yeah, okay, there's always context to stuff, is part of a long-time thread of discussion within Western philosophy, Hegel and Marx and so on. The end of history is when the battle among political systems is resolved, and the question about the end of history came up with the fall of the Soviet Union, the failure of the communist model, which of course is still holding on in some very big places, but toward the idea of Western liberal democracy and all of that kind of stuff. Well, no, we're not at the end of history. There's still a lot to be done here. There's still let's call it a battle of methods to really get anything done. So I argue that, no, the race is still underway. The race to automate, in our context, bringing this back down to earth just a little bit, the context of having machines understand, participate, and enhance human communications and the business processes that deal with people. So I don't know if you all recognize who's in this picture. Does anyone? No, this is Alan Turing. So if you study computer science, you're probably familiar with Turing machine. Turing machine is an abstraction of computing. The idea with a Turing machine is that you have a paper tape strip. This is from the 40s, I guess. I didn't look that one up. And you can encode in very basic symbols a computer program. Any computer program, according to Turing, could be encoded in potentially extremely long paper tape strip of just basic decisions and so on. So that's a Turing machine. It's an abstraction for computing in general. But Turing also articulated something called the Turing test. So the idea behind the Turing test, as expressed with the technology that was prevalent at that day, was that you have a teletype. It's a basic text interface. I did programming on teletype machines with time sharing when I was in high school. And it is wired to something in the next room. That something in the next room could be a computer or it could be a human. And you carry on a conversation. Can a reasonably intelligent human observer conclude conclusively whether the person or the thing on the other end of the line is a human or is a machine? Once a machine can convince a reasonably intelligent human that, well, not convinced, once the machine can simulate a human thinking, human responses to a sufficient degree of believability, then that machine will have passed the Turing test. Well, the Turing test still hasn't been passed. There, we have bots. If you go type, people were talking about Justin Bieber as distorting Twitter results on a lot of things because Justin Bieber if you put that into Twitter, it will bring about a whole bunch of automated tweets and auto follows and so on. Well, the point here is that we have bots that automatically respond to certain information, but they're not convincing. So we don't have any bots yet that can pass a Turing test. IBM Watson is a single point. It's an answer. It's a question, and it responds with an answer. But it's not carrying on a conversation. I think there's a lot of misuse of the term conversation, especially in the social media analytics world, where a given message, tweet, Facebook update, whatever, is characterized as a conversation, whereas it's really just a single message. A conversation is much more complicated. It involves give and take. And then we also have the idea of narrative and argument, that you string together a whole bunch of messages that take the people who are listening or reading from one place to another. So no, the race is still underway. We've reached a number of milestones. I list my milestones here: language understanding, text, speech, and video. We're further along in some than in others. Yeah, sure, there's image recognition that works reasonably well nowadays, that could have taken my photo from my previous slide and said, yep, that's Alan Turing. Just as people are surely working, I don't know who they are, but well, aside from the so-called three-letter government agencies and their equivalents in other companies, on image recognition that will take your social media profile, the picture that you have attached to it if it's one of yourself. I have one of myself attached to my Twitter, LinkedIn, and so on. And it will do an image recognition to find other images of you that are out on the public internet or within databases, you know, the equivalent of a fingerprint analysis on images. That stuff is underway. Same thing for videos. I remember there was a DARPA, Defense Advanced Projects Research Agency project a number of years ago that was looking at people's gaits, because the way they walk. Because just as our fingerprints are close to unique, our retinal images are unique, so is the way that we walk. Of course, they can be disguised and so on. But so you do a video analysis in order to essentially fingerprint, the equivalent of fingerprinting something by how he or she walks. We have a challenge, as I just said, with narrative, discourse, argument, with messages that go beyond simple statements. I think we're doing pretty well with information extraction, the area that Lexalytics centers on, so I won't say much more about that. With knowledge structuring integration, I'd say we're also doing pretty well. So that means taking the information that's been extracted and maybe putting it in a relational database or putting it in RDF, that's Resource Description Framework form, which is the format that is, I should say it's the protocol that's associated with the Semantic Web. We're doing pretty well on knowledge structuring and integration, but we could be doing better. Inference and synthesis, that is the idea that you're taking a bunch of competing or collaborative or corroborative pieces of information and you're tying them together in order to form conclusions. So this is a challenge that people are working on. Language generation. You know, Watson, I guess the responses were synthesized and so on, but what I'm talking about is something that maybe would restate the Turing test in today's technology, or not even today's, but tomorrow, where it's not using a teletype to communicate back to you, but rather is using a synthesized voice. Because when we communicate verbally, there's all kinds of intonations and inflections that reflect not only in languages like Chinese, the actual meaning of a word that would be different if it were intonated differently, but also our moods and emotions. The rapidity of our speech patterns can indicate whether we're under stress, for instance, or whether we're attracted to something. So there's work to be done there in language generation and interpretation in order to have true conversations in the text realm and further autonomous ones. So what we get to is this notion of convergence of a bunch of text technologies. So I'm going to bring the talk down to earth a little bit more now, but the conversion involves breaking down those silos. So again, I put the word text in parentheses in my title. It's not just text analysis silos. It's general silos for dealing with information and analyses. So we do have this notion of the singularity that is popular among some people with a bunch of different definitions, but I think they kind of have at their root the idea that machines will become super intelligent, more intelligent, although not necessarily in the same way as humans, more intelligent than humans. So I found a couple of images that I wanted to use there. I found the one on the left after finding the one on the right, which is the one I was actually looking for. This is from a Twilight Zone episode from the early 60s. So the story there is that, yeah, we got Mr. Alien here. Big head, must mean he's smart. And he has a book there that's written in the alien language. And there are a couple of linguists who struggle in this episode, which I barely remember seeing, but I remembered the episode enough to go look for it. They find this book, and after a lot of work, they managed to translate the symbols on the cover of the book to see that the book says, "to serve man." And, you know, the aliens are real nice guys to the humans, so they figure, yeah, the aliens just want to help us develop and so on. And then on further translation, they discover that the book is actually a cookbook. So to serve man, well, there are multiple meanings there that depend on the particular background and context of the person who's doing the communicating, and what you read is not necessarily going to be the same thing as what he wrote. So we have Bender here. I had to ask one of my kids to tell me the name of this guy. Anyway, Bender from Futurama, and this is clearly a takeoff on the Twilight Zone episode. So anyway, Bender is, you know, intelligent enough to communicate or something like that. Anyway, we're not quite at the point of singularity yet. This is Futurama is a relatively benevolent version of the future. But you know, I think people recognize that we're kind of reaching that point. But where are we today with text analysis? In effect, what kind of silos do we have today? The text analysis, text analytics, has been very successful in a number of areas with lots of room for future growth. I grouped two areas above the line here because these are areas that text analytics has been operating in for years very successfully. The first areas were life sciences like pharmaceutical drug discovery and intelligence and counterterrorism. But in recent years, we've had great success with text analytics applications in other areas that you can read there. And Lexalytics currently plays and is working in several of these areas. And I was surprised to learn that you all are working on some initiatives in, for instance, the e-discovery area. So, you know, I think that's great. The idea in e-discovery is that when there's litigation, the parties have to produce documentation, that could be email in particular, but other forms of documentation relative to the court case to the opposing parties. So how do you find and produce that information? So these are areas where text analytics is working today. So I said that I have worked as an industry analyst, and I did a study back in 2009, and I think my results are still good. The findings are still good. They still match what I'm hearing from people about the market today. Where are they using text? Well, top category in my response was brand, product, reputation management, competitive intelligence, voice of the customer, and so on. I will admit that there's a bit of selection bias here. Selection bias in a survey means, well, for instance, if I were to ask you, what's the best text analytics company out on the market, I would bet that a much higher proportion of people in this room would answer Lexalytics than if I were to ask people in a broader conference, or for that matter, if I were to ask people on the street in Times Square, probably most of the people I encountered would say, if they said anything to me, would say, what are you talking about? So there's some selection bias here, but I think these results are kind of useful for you all in understanding how people are using these technologies. You know, you can read the slides for yourself. I'm not going to go down this any further. The name of my report is here. It's freely available. I have it posted to SlideShare and so on. The results were corroborated. They matched up with results found by Fern Helper, who's another analyst who works with Hurwitz and Associates. She did her own study around the same time, found results of voice of the customer, competitive intelligence, that's my number 2, and 3 here, that pretty much matched mine with, I should have put a vertical grid on this chart, but I mean, she didn't, I just reproduced hers, that pretty much matched mine in percentages. I think these findings are still pretty accurate as a reflection of the market. I asked people who are currently using text analytics as of that time, and of course there are many more now, about the textual information that they are analyzing or planning to analyze. And there's an interesting split here between the top 3 and the bottom 2. The bottom 2 are either solicited or in-group or enterprise information sources, whereas the top 3 are things that are not under your direct control if you're a business. It's information that's posted online in free forums, and so on. Obviously, a huge amount of interest in user-generated content from social platforms. And I asked people about what information that they're looking to extract. Top of the list, of course, is named entities, people, companies, geographic areas, and so on. Sentiment is significant on this list. Sentiment, in my question, meant opinions, attitudes, and emotions, a broad grouping of subjective information with 60%, and topics and themes in between here. So one argument to make about the text analytics market is that people want to extract sentiment, and they want to extract not only entities, not only names, but also topics and themes. That's generalizations. Are people talking about the economy? That's a generalization, a topic, and it's not a specific indicator like the inflation rate or something. And I infer that they want to assign sentiment, opinions, attitudes, and emotions to particular named entities and topics. They want to go far beyond what a lot of the social and online analysis tools are doing nowadays, where they're just rating a sentiment score for a document or a tweet or a message. That kind of stuff is crude, and we can go beyond it, and I infer that people do want to go beyond it. So let's get back to what's the future, what's developing. But before we do that, we'll take a look in the past. The situation now is very different from what it was 13 years ago at this, 12 years ago at this point. Marty Hurst is a professor at Berkeley, and she wrote a paper untangling text data mining. For her, text data mining meant something a little bit different from what text analytics means to us, but it's really kind of half of text analytics. She said that the nascent field of text data mining has the peculiar distinction of a name and a fair amount of hype, but is of yet almost no practitioners. Well, I'll argue to you, and I think you'll readily believe me, that that situation has changed. So I'm looking at the market. Let's do a bit of a regrouping, a resegmentation, if you will, into broad technology areas. So a few slides ago, I did application segmentation. Now I'll do a technology segmentation. I said earlier that I had an earlier slide with 5 steps of text analytics. This kind of mirrors that. It reflects it with some tuning. We have information acquisition. You have to collect and gather information that's relevant to the business problem that you're going to be confronting. We have natural language processing, including as a service natural language processing, area where Lexalytics is solidly placed. We have information management and semantics. That is the databases that collect and hold text extracted and other information for further analyses. We have search-based or search-oriented applications, an area that, for instance, I would infer that the people from Coveo, an area that I would infer that they are moving into. There are plenty of search-based or search-oriented applications, including, I mentioned e-discovery before. That's one because it's heavily reliant on search to get you to the information that you need, and it is fueled and greatly enhanced by text analytics. And then we have what I group as enterprise applications, including customer relationship, customer experience management, and online reputation management and all that kind of stuff. In terms of market sizing, I called myself earlier an accidental industry analyst because the Gartners and the Forresters were not in this space when I started looking at it really in 2002. They aren't, they're still not as much in the space as they could or should be. Here's my market size estimate, which I break down by those 5 categories that I put in there previously. I've done this exercise for a number of years. This year's exercise involves let's call it a rebaselining of the way that I go about my estimates. So for 2009, I had estimated 425 million. If you add together all of these figures here, you get something a lot larger than that because I chose to expand, to rebaseline, to expand how I looked at text analytics. So, you know, you get situations with a company like Autonomy. Autonomy is a search-based application company. They do e-discovery, they do contact centers, they do enterprise feedback, but they position themselves as a search-based application vendor. They still have a very significant search platform and so on. Their platform, IDLE, the Intelligent Data Operating Layer, I think it's called, is reliant on text analytics. So in those cases, I allocate a portion of their overall revenues to text analytics. So you can see the companies that I've listed here as examples in a number of categories. The one category where I didn't list any companies is maybe the core one, not maybe, it's the core one for our discussion today, and that is the natural language processing, semantics, and text analytics. There are a lot of companies in this space, some well established, a lot of startups, and you know, it's a great space to be in with very significant growth and very significant potential growth. And that means not only in revenues generated, but in value generated to organizations that adopt the technologies. Let's go to a somewhat forward-looking view at this point, text technology initiatives. So once again, we're talking about silos. When I already argued that when you have a bunch of technologies that interoperate and cooperate, then you can get something that provides greater value than any single technology. So we combined a number of technologies. Looking at where we are now and where we're going, I'm going to list 6, 4 here and 2 on the next 2 slides. Semantic search, got a few quotations there to support it. One from some leading people in the field. The addition of explicit semantics can improve navigation and research search. So that's stuff like faceted navigation, for instance, that you're probably familiar with, and if you aren't, you should be. Sentiment analysis, what you all are interested in. I have a quotation from a leading researcher, Bing Liu at the University of Illinois at Chicago. The web has dramatically changed the way that people express their views and opinions. We all know that. It gives a level of anonymity, reach, ability to form communities dynamically where you might not have known people before. Well, you form a community spontaneously around a particular topic, and you drop in and out of communities. If you're traveling to Los Angeles, you suddenly drop into a community of people who have visited Los Angeles. They may no longer belong to the community, but their tracks are still there in terms of the items they've posted, the reviews, and so on. So the web's changed that. Listening platforms, you know, that's the Radian 6s as the leading example and a notable one given their the acquisition that was just announced by Salesforce. Bruce Temkin is a leading analyst in customer experience management. The future is clearly about analyzing feedback in any form, not just by surveys, but also online, that your customers give it. It's a trend that won't go away, and I agree with him. Question answering, what surfaced in IBM Watson. Matthew Glotzbach is at Google. He was the person who launched the Google Search Appliance, that yellow box that you can supposedly install and have all of your enterprise search worries go away. Matthew Glotzbach says, question answering is the future of enterprise search, from 5 years ago. Text visualization, that is underrated, I believe, although widely used in some shallow forms, in the service of knowledge discovery. One of the key processes I mentioned earlier. How do you deal with the information that is surfaced by the steps before analysis in the whole overall text analysis and analytics process? Visualization is a great way to deal with large data sets where connections become much more visible when you do some kind of graphical presentation rather than looking at lists of results or tables of data or whatever. Then we have Web 3.0 and the Semantic Web. One of our speakers yesterday was Ronan Feldman, actually, who was one of the founders, along with people like Marty Hurst, whom I quoted earlier, of text analytics. Text analytics is driving the Semantic Web. The idea there is that if you're going to create a widespread federated database of information, whether it's RDF structured or somehow else, you have to have a way of getting the semantics that you're storing. Text analytics discovers the semantic meaning in information that's already out there and that we're producing. So going through these 6 relatively quickly with a slide each, 2 for the first one, which was search and information retrieval. I have a diagram here which points to an intersection between search with a BI component to it and text analytics to create semantic search. In other words, search that allows you to categorize elements according to facets, which are predetermined high-level categories, or you could be categorizing according to a much broader and deeper taxonomy. In any case, that's one form of semantic search, which also involves interpretation of the search queries that people are putting in order to try to discover their intent. Search, BI, and text analytics join together to support information access. The idea that you're not going to be providing, as a search provider, just a hit list of documents. You're going to be providing some form of aggregated, synthesized information that responds to the need of the particular user, that person's intent. So another example of semantic search, one that involves Lexalytics. We have some sentiment analysis ratings here. We have presentation of search results in a more traditional form with some summarization. We have faceted navigation here according to 5 high-level facets or categories. This actually had the plug pulled on it over 2 years ago. It was a project by the Financial Times to present financial news that crossed the web in a form that would be easy to navigate for people who are searching for information on particular topics. And they pulled the plug on it for a number of reasons, I would interpret. One is, despite some ads here, like this one, they didn't have any model to generate significant revenue from it. There were also licensing technologies from at least 4 different providers, Lexalytics one of them, and they were also licensing expensive news feeds in order to support it. It's not just enough to have great technology. You have to have a business model behind it that will support providing something of value and that will pay for that. Sentiment analysis, I'm not going to say much about it because it's the reason we're here. I just want to recognize it, that our communications are inherently subjective, that we often have opinion that masquerades as facts. We need technologies that can tell the difference and that can produce, once again, for business purposes, the sentiment, opinion, attitudes, and so on that you need to do whatever you need to do. So I like this particular example, came online, I just found it. It's easy to eat right, and that's a fact. Well, is there any better indication that someone is offering an opinion than the assertion, that's a fact? Well, just supports the point that there's a lot of opinion that masquerades as fact, that just because someone states something for that matter doesn't mean that it's true. We need technologies that can help us tell the difference. I talked about question answering before. I talked about information access. Wolfram Alpha is a great example of that. It takes queries, and if it understands the query, it doesn't provide you with a hit list of documents. It provides you with information extracted from its knowledge base, its database, which, by the way, is populated in part by text analytics with a healthy dose of what people like to call curation. In other words, knowledgeable intervention in order to make sure that the information in there is of good quality and is relevant. And it presents the information in response to the query based on what it judges you're looking for. So this is a great example of question answering. I talked about text visualization. Some of these images here are actually somewhat old. Some are kind of shallow, like word clouds, which you've all seen, but they're useful nonetheless. This Silobreaker image, the Silobreaker came out first 3 years ago. It's openly available information access engine, search if you prefer, but among other things, it extracts entities, that is names of individuals, companies, and so on, from the underlying data sources, articles in this case, and it makes connections. It's very important. And it's a visual presentation that's interactive. That's also very important. I can click on one of these dots that you see connecting each of the sets of nodes and find the article from which it extracted the information in order to make the connection between those two nodes. Some other stuff that is useful in understanding the information content of text. This is something that came from the New York Times. They do great visualization work. Of course, they deal extremely heavily in text. So this is a visualization that is interactive to a certain degree of democratic debates from the last presidential election cycle. You can take a look at it online. You can find it yourself. We have the Semantic Web. Here's a vision of linked data very complex, loads of information sources that have been put into, or they hope will be put into compatible sources, so that you can issue a query that will spider itself, federate itself across the linked data sources that are on the net in order to provide answers. There's a technology stack that sits behind it, and so on, with a vision that is still fairly true to this quotation from 1998 from Web and Semantic Web creator Tim Berners-Lee. Semantic Web is a web of data, like a global database. Well, yeah, and it's about exposing, sharing, and connecting pieces of data, information, and knowledge. You know, that's all great stuff, but it's pie in the sky. And what we need are technologies that can answer ad hoc needs without prejudging the intent of the user, which are people who might be yourselves or your own customers. So we can go ahead and do a lot of this stuff now with the technologies that we have. The idea of breaking down data silos, however, is a great one. We can do it now with text analytics and related technologies. So I have a retake on my 2 slide to make it 2 prime, which is to say that, well, the semantic web, a little bit of snarkiness here, is really about copious government research funding that's driving the whole thing, especially in Europe, in Ireland, in Germany, the UK, the European Union, and so on. So in any case, companies are doing and delivering on what remains just a vision for the semantic web. Let's look at some other stuff that I've touched on up to this point, that problems we really need to solve in order to create a greater integrated solution that incorporates text analytics and incorporates the areas that text analytics is going. But beyond polarity sentiment analysis, a lot of talk about that at yesterday's Sentiment Analysis Symposium, the idea that we need to do better than just positive, negative, neutral. And doing better doesn't just mean, instead of doing +1 or -1 for positive or negative, it doesn't just mean doing +5 to -5 with 11 options to indicate intensity or something like that. It means being able to classify in ways that make sense for your business problem. So if you're doing customer service or support, what good does it really do for you to say that someone is positive or negative about an experience in staying at the Bellagio in Las Vegas, and so I'm picking on that example. What I really want to know in a customer service scenario, especially if I want to react promptly, even in close to real time, is whether I'm dealing with someone who is angry or happy or sad. This is beyond polarity sentiment analysis. I want emotions like those. I want intent signals. Is someone posting something that suggests that that person is about to buy a given object but is still in the market for it, in which case I have an opportunity to convert that person into my customer? Is the person posting something on Twitter that says, yeah, I'm just finally so fed up with the AT&T signal in New York City that I have to find a different provider? This is an invitation for intervention that will prevent churn. These are intent signals. We need, and we also fear, identity resolution and profile extraction. Identity resolution can be the kind of stuff I was talking about earlier with image analysis, where the software says this is a picture of so-and-so and identifies what that person is doing. That's a little bit scary. So is the idea, people like to talk about the creepiness factor of monitoring Twitter and then sending, if you're a company, sending a note to that person, oh, it's like Big Brother or something like that. At the same time, frankly, it's inevitable. These technologies, for better or worse, are supporting that, the text technologies. So that can mean doing a text analysis that looks at the patterns of speech, the vocabulary used and stuff like that, in order to discern demographic profile categories. What is the age of this person? Is it a male or female? What's the ethnic background? Stuff like that. That's a broad type of profile. And this stuff is used for targeted online advertising in order to get the right kind of ads to people. And it's used in conjunction with behavioral tracking as well. But the profiling, if you really want to do customer service right, would be stuff like monitoring Twitter and then trying to discern who the person is who posted, I had a really bad meal at such and so restaurant, so that you can reach out to that person in order to try to convert that customer into someone who's going to be happy. Semantic data integration, the kind of integration that I just talked about, where you use profiles that are inferred or explicit. You tie together transactional records. You know, is this person a customer of mine already who's posting on TripAdvisor? And you know, should I be offering that person something in order to turn a bad experience that was posted there into a customer who will give me another chance? We need a high level of data integration and complex data there, and we need semantic information in order to do that. Speech analytics, understanding the intonation, the patterns of speech, the vocabulary used as an indicator of mood and emotional states, an area that people are working on but that we're not there yet. Discourse analysis, understanding the flow of communications, of conversations, that understanding that any given statement or message doesn't occur in isolation, and it shouldn't be analyzed in isolation. Rich media content analytics, mining videos, audios, images, and so on, in order to not only extract, well, yeah, this is an image that was taken by my Droid 2, which is right here, on such and such a date, and so you know, metadata that's automatically generated, understanding not only the envelope, but what's internal to that particular message. And there's business value there. And then augmented reality, the idea that you can use a smartphone and you can aim it at some street scene and have software that recognizes where you are. Maybe it uses the GPS signal to determine where you are. Maybe it uses an image match, and then overlays the coffee shops and other retail opportunities in the area. You know that people are working on this stuff. It's not perfect. There are sensitivities that relate to privacy and so on, but it's happening. We have a lot of challenges, and I list two here, and this is by way of conclusion. We have the challenge that we do have these silos. I love this quotation from Philip Rossum, who's an industry analyst with the Data Warehousing Institute. He did a study of the unstructured data market back in 2008. From his report, I pulled this quotation. Organizations embracing text analytics all report having an epiphany moment when they suddenly knew more than before. An epiphany moment, that's aha. I don't know how many times I've been asked, tell me something I don't know, coming into an organization as a data analyst. This is what people really want to know. They want to know, they know they don't know everything. They want to know what they don't know. All the same, I talk frequently to people in the conventional business intelligence and data warehousing world, and they're struggling with this idea of unstructured information, of text-sourced information, and how to incorporate it into their analyses. So there's an awareness of the problem and of the need, but awareness is not enough. We really need to push the envelope to move forward, to get these different technologies working together to break down those information system silos, to break down the barriers that those silos represent. We also have, as a market challenge, shallow technology. I love picking on Nielsen, Buzzmetrics, Blog Pulse. You know, I have 3 lines here. I took this one last spring, but I keep using it instead of generating a new one because I like it. I decided to chart Obama, the yellow line, versus Lady Gaga is the green line, versus the iPad, which is this blue line. And I have this spike on the iPad in late March, early April. Anyone understand why is that spike there? This is 2010. Well, it's simply because that's when the iPad was actually shipped. It was interesting, one of our speakers at the Sentiment Symposium yesterday was looking at Twitter movie reviews, and he used a couple of movies in particular, and one movie had, you know, somewhat jiggly variant line moving across, and then there was a point where it just dropped. And in that case, that was when the movie was actually released. So the opinions went down, the gap between anticipation and reality. Here, we're simply measuring the share of online conversation. Counting is good, but counting is not enough. Counting doesn't give you, even trend analysis doesn't give you the root causes behind this. We need to do a lot better. There's a lot of shallow technology that's out there, especially in the social media, so-called analytics world. I was positively shocked when I looked at one company that I wrote an article there. I mentioned the company, but not by name. You know, they had something like $60 million a year in revenue, and they have a social media analysis element. And their sentiment analysis is based purely on a keyword list and the assignment of positive to negative to that keyword. to each keyword. They didn't even handle negators like not, much less the complexities of human language. I'll tell you who that was later. But I was positively shocked by this. And they're selling product to companies that are using their products without knowing how shallow and deficient they are, especially in light of what we can do right now. So it's a great idea to break down those silos, to move things forward, to move forward toward the singularity where the machines become much more intelligent. This is a shot from the end of 2001, A Space Odyssey, where Dave is in the psychedelic light tunnel and so on. Anyway, you know, you read his expression here, you and I read his expression here, and we see maybe some uncertainty. He just doesn't know where he's going. He feels like he's not in control of where he's going. Machine couldn't understand that out of this expression. Machine would probably be confused by the glints of light that are reflected on his helmet visor and so on. The technology's getting a lot better, but we aren't even using. We as an industry in general, the end users, the companies that are in the middle that are OEM licensees, we're not even using the technology that's available now to the greatest possible extent. So we have some challenges. They involve siloed thinking, silos that segregate different technologies and different solutions that can and should be interoperating in order to create something much greater and something much better. We have data silos that can be solved by semantic, dynamic data integration that can be fueled by text analytics. We have organizational silos that say, you know, this is my job. I have marketing data, but I'm a marketing person. I don't need to provide that marketing data to the product design groups. We have loads of silos that can be broken down. Unstructured information, text-sourced information is really yet another one of those. The technologies exist to break down those silos, and you know, it's great if we can move forward in order to do that. So I've spoken a bit long. I am finished, but I'd be happy to take questions now, maybe a little discussion if you want me to. Otherwise, there are probably opportunities later.
Yeah, if people have questions. Actually, I have one question.
Do you want to, do you have a microphone that can be used?
I'll grab it right up
No,
here.
because of the video, if you...
Yeah, just repeat my question.
Okay.
I know you're good at that. If somebody came, an investor came and gave you $2 million to start a company to do something technology, what would you do? $5 million.
So what would I do if someone gave me $2 million, $5 million, $8 million to start a company in text analytics? We're at the point now where there are loads of research initiatives in universities and so on that are building systems from the ground up, from scratch nowadays. I wouldn't do that. There are a number of options to operate at a higher level. That could be at a solution level or an application level, rather than building the underlying tools yourself. So, for instance, I would look at using, it's not just because I'm standing here at the Lexalytics users group, I would look at using an existing service that's available as an API, since everything happens online, such as Lexalytics, but there are others that I won't talk about, and just passing my information for analysis to them in order to do those analyses instead of building that myself. Or the other option is to use existing technology, for instance, the Gate open source text analytics technology or the Python NLTK, and you can, those tools have their strengths and weaknesses. You can create your own language rules for Gate, your own lexicons and so on. I've done it myself. You don't have to build the underlying technology. It includes machine learning, by the way. You don't have to build it yourself anymore. You can build a solution that focuses on on a particular business need or application. So if I had that money to do it, I would look at finding an unmet market need and filling it using technologies that are out there already. And I know examples of companies that have bootstrapped that way. I'll give you one of them, which is Ativio. It's a company that's located near Boston, started by people who used to be with FAST before the Microsoft takeover. And their technology does sort of unified analysis for business intelligence types of application. It's essentially a search-based application. And they use, I don't know, two dozen different open source packages. They saw it the way that I'm describing, that you don't have to build the underlying technologies yourself. You package and integrate together a bunch of technologies that are really very good in order to create something distinctive. Yeah, do people walk the talk? So how much work has been done to study whether, to what extent people actually do the things that they say online? This is a huge problem with, again, social media, so-called analytics. I'll put that jibe at it again, where people talk about influence measures based on how many followers you have on Twitter, or how many friends you have on Facebook, and how often a message is retweeted, and so on. Not only as a measurement of online influence, are those things really limited, because they don't bridge over to, you know, someone might retweet your message on Twitter, but is the retweeted message something that you've produced, you know, maybe a blog or an article or something, or is it just a retweet of some news that you happen to be the first person to post? This is a distorted view of influence if you're looking only online. Influence is really about the ability to drive transactions that have business value to them. So if I say that the Book of Mormon is here on Broadway is a really great show, does that drive people to actually buy tickets to the Book of Mormon? How do you actually measure that my tweet or my blog has actually had that influence that led people to spend their money? It's very difficult. You need the ability to do that kind of data integration that I was talking about, where you resolve identities and you tie that to transactions that are recorded in transactional databases that have been the back end of business operations for decades now. It's not an easy problem at all. It's one that market researchers are working to model. Maybe you do it via some kind of sampling and extrapolation. I don't have a sure answer for you there, but it is definitely a challenge. And once again, it fits in this silo category where online social should not be kept as a silo, nor should enterprise be a silo. We should find ways to break down and integrate, pull information and match it and link it from these disparate sources, because we will determine greater business value. Who is a true influencer rather than who happens to get retweeted a lot? Anyone else for now? Great, well, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to speak this morning.